Hey guys, here we are nearly at the end of 2020, a year which I think you'll agree has sucked more than Paris Hilton, a vacuum cleaner and lollipop convention. Plus, here in the UK we get, I estimate, 3 minutes of daylight during the day, and yet there is an upside to all of this. What is that? It's the opportunity for lots of low light filming, which is what we're here to talk about today. A test with the Sony ZV1 to see how it performs in these low light nighttime situations, plus a whole bunch of tips on how to get the best out of the ZV1 if you're filming in the dark.
What are we going to cover? I hear you ask. We will start with the basics of how to set up your ZV1 for low light, and then tests of image quality, ISO noise, stabilisation, colours, picture profiles, autofocus. I think that's everything. Oh no, and slow-mo. Whew. After that, I've got a bunch of tips to help you get the best out of your ZV1 in low light. So let's go.
So the first thing in terms of basics, for low light, I strongly recommend you keep your aperture at f1.8 as wide open as possible. Number one, this lets in the maximum amount of light which you're going to need in these low light situations. And number two, it helps to create the shallow depth of field we need for that beautiful blurry background bokeh, hopefully very evident in the lights behind me. And number three, as you'll be able to see right here, we got a Christmas tree. So Merry Christmas, you filthy animals.
Did you see me getting a little bit out of focus there? We're going to come back to talk about focus in more detail later, but right now, let's talk about everybody's favourite rhyme for butter. That's right, shutter.
Now a quick demonstration of light flicker with the shutter. So right now we're at 1/50 and we shouldn't see any flicker. Go to 1/60 and you can start to see a bit of flicker on that Berkeley sign. The higher we take shutter, so if we go to 200 for example, the flicker becomes more apparent and it gets worse and worse as we go higher. If we go below 50, like so, right now we're on 40, and you can still see a bit of flicker on that sign.
Why do we have light flicker? Fun fact, most electric lights aren't actually continuously on. They flicker on and off really quickly. So quickly that your eye can't detect it, but a camera sensor can. If your shutter is set out of time with the frequency of that electric light source, then you're going to end up with footage that's got a flickering, strobing effect more unattractive than Boris Johnson in lingerie. Here in the UK and several other countries, electric lights powered by the main electricity grid are all at 50 Hertz. That means 50 flickers per second, so a shutter of 1/50 is what you need to sync up and avoid flickering your footage. In the US and many other countries, it is a 60 Hertz power grid, so a shutter of 1/60 might be what you need. My overall recommendation, make sure if you have artificial lights in your shot to test your shutter and make sure you don't have flicker before you record any important footage. Now, to ISO. Some say it stands for incestuous snake outrage, but what we know for sure is it sets your camera's sensitivity to light. And given I've recommended keeping your aperture around f1.8 and your shutter at a fairly fixed level as well, ISO becomes even more important because it's our main way of controlling exposure in low light conditions. Like a man juggling a mango, a chainsaw, and a grenade, we need to properly consider three distinct things. One, overall image exposure. We can change this quite a bit in post-production, but we need to capture at least enough light to have a usable image. Two, image noise. The higher your ISO, the more image noise you get, just like our example right here. And three, autofocus. Even if you get number 1 and 2 to your liking, you might not have a high enough ISO to get the ZV1 autofocus to work in low light. Let's start with ISO and exposure. Here are some similar shots captured at a high and low ISO. I'm showing you shots before and after color grading from a low ISO of 500, where I felt there was a moody look which nicely matched up with reality, and a high ISO of between 4000 and 6400, which is where the auto ISO on the ZV1 was taking us. I've color graded to my taste, adding a bit of contrast and emphasizing the dark while trying to match the overall brightness levels of both shots. The higher ISO shots get graded darker but retain more vivid, saturated lights. Low ISO shots get graded up for clarity but retain a more moody and muted look. I like both. I feel like the low ISO shots are a bit more cinematic and the higher ones a little bit more vivid. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm also planning a video on how to color grade with HLG, so if you have any questions for that, let me know down in the comments. Speaking of HLG, brings us to our next topic, distractingly grim noise. Not a Nicki Minaj compilation album, but the image noise that all digital cameras suffer when you push ISO to higher levels. I'm going to focus on HLG because that is the picture profile that I use, but if you're interested in a deep dive on all of the ZV1's picture profiles, Let me know. That is in my maybe ideas pile right now, along with a bacon flavoured soft drink. Sony gives you 3 flavours of HLG, which are optimised either for image noise or dynamic range. HLG1 is optimised for lowest image noise, whereas HLG3 is optimised for maximal dynamic range, but at the cost of more image noise. That's the one that I tend to use in the daytime, and HLG2 is supposed to be a balance somewhere in the middle. The example here takes us from lowest to highest available ISO with HLG1 on the left and HLG3 on the right. A good spot to watch is the upper left of each image. Noise is more noticeable and problematic in HLG3 from about ISO 1000 onwards, up until ISO 8000 or so, where I feel like both images start to get problematically noisy. I also noticed some slight colour difference. HLG3 retained a darker blue coloured sky, more similar to reality, whereas HLG1 seemed a little bit more yellowish. However, this doesn't seem to be the case in every situation. In these examples, you can see HLG1, 2, and 3, along with the default ZV1 picture profile, and I don't see much colour difference or noise difference in the HLG versions. The colour in the default ZV1 profile is way darker and higher contrast with more red and orange. Could be cool in some situations, but I much prefer HLG for more true-to-life colours and a flatter profile from which I can colour grade. I should add that a quick check of other profiles show they all get noisy as hell around ISO 8000, so most of the conclusions in this section would hold for those as well. I guess my conclusion here is I want to do more testing, including on HLG2, but using HLG1 or 3 can give you really nice results after color grading, so just be mindful of their trade-offs. Now onto ISO and autofocus. The ZV1's autofocus is one of its best features, and in good light it is almost flawless, but in low light, it's a different story. Close to a light source, you can get great autofocus lock-on, even at the lowest possible ISO. But as soon as you travel around and move between lighter and darker areas, the ZV1's focus can struggle. Using auto ISO, even relatively well-lit areas have the ZV1 shoot up to ISO 6400, the max that I was allowing, given that from 8000 onwards, I find the noise to be just too bad to use. Even up at ISO 6400, the autofocus can still sometimes lose you. I'd say it's consistent about 80% of the time, especially if you are in bright light and your face is directly lit, but it can lose you if you are backlit, moving between dark and light, and sometimes even just randomly in a way that never happens in the daytime. If you can tolerate higher image noise, then higher ISO will preserve face or eye detection for a larger percentage of the time, but even at the max ISO of 12,800, the ZV1 can still lose you. Here's some footage with auto ISO allowed all the way to the maximum of 12,800. I've also applied noise reduction. You can decide whether the results are usable or just too noisy. One other consideration when using auto ISO is the potential for odd-looking changes in exposure, particularly the light or darkness of the sky, like you can see in the example here. Probably not the end of the world for vlogging, but you can decide how much this bothers you. Just before I give you my tips on how to get the best results in low light with the ZV1, thank you so much for watching the video so far. If you end up finding the video enjoyable or informative, please consider a like, subscribe, or share. And of course, let me know your thoughts and questions down in the comments. Thank you. So now, onto some tips. And tip number 1, using manual focus. By using manual focus, you can get around having to try and balance image noise versus autofocus availability. Now, if you don't know how to quickly toggle between autofocus and manual focus, I suggest you check out my video on tips you may not know for the ZV1, which will show you exactly how to do that. Link in the description.
Okay, we are trying manual focus once again because facing in this direction at ISO 3200, the ZV1 can't lock onto either face or eye autofocus. So we're going to try and see if I am competent enough, and let's be real, I'm definitely not, to hold the gimbal at a fixed distance and therefore get the focus that we want on the face that we really don't. The other thing to bear in mind, I'm keenly aware I could be out of focus as I say this, is it's difficult to judge focus from the small screen on the ZV1 when you're holding the camera at a reasonable distance away for vlogging, which makes it doubly cumbersome. That's right, I was walking on the cycle path like some kind of insane moron.
So long as you can keep your ZV1 the same distance away, you're going to be in focus, and you can set your ISO to whatever level you like, including dark cinematic looks like in this example.
Good colour work, expensive flat owner. If my flat wasn't so crappy, maybe I would have nice decorations too. You didn't think about that, did you?
This would not be achievable with autofocus. Now, over to Past Dave for some other tips and trade-offs on manual focus.
I guess in my mind, along with all the terrible jokes and repressed trauma, it comes down to a trade-off. Do you want to have potentially some sky lightning and some not so smooth changes between exposure as you pass by different light sources by using auto ISO, and potentially higher noise, although I'll let you decide what you think is an acceptable level. Or do you want to have extreme muscle control and real precision of how far away you're holding the camera by using manual focus as a solution to keep a lower ISO and preserve a darker image?
Top tip 2. A lot of those trade-offs between ISO, autofocus, and even shutter can be ignored when you are shooting B-roll. As long as you're happy with your shot and don't have any light flicker, you can just shoot. The examples you're seeing here are some of my favorite results for low light B-roll, and I'd suggest you experiment between capturing footage at lower and higher ISOs so that when you color grade, you can make a decision on what overall look you like the best. Tip number 3 is on stabilization. Throughout my tests, I tried a bunch of different stabilization options, and the Xeon Crane M2 gimbal was the smoothest, as you would expect for the price. That smoothness is especially helpful because low light combined with a fairly slow shutter of around 1/50 means that motion blur from steps as you're walking doing your vlog can be more distracting. I also found that active steady shot plus a selfie stick grip extension worked just fine, as well as handheld with the Zoom wide angle lens and using a selfie stick, active steady shot, and the Zoom wide angle lens. I actually did a deep dive comparing the various stabilization methods for the ZV1, so check out that video in the description. The only stabilization method I'd advise you use with caution in low light is Catalyst browse stabilization. Catalyst usually gives great results, but relies on quite a high shutter speed, which is difficult in low light for all the reasons we discussed earlier. At lower shutter speeds, like 1/50, Catalyst can create weird motion blur artifacts in your footage. If your camera and subject are both slow moving, like in our example here, Catalyst can still produce great results at 1/50 shutter, but for anything much faster moving, I would recommend other stabilization methods instead. And if you aren't familiar with these things already, then check out links in the description for guides to the Xeon Crane M2 gimbal, Zoom wide angle lens, and Catalyst browse, all of which are awesome features or accessories for the ZV1. Tip number 4, last but not least, is slow motion. Was that convincing? I bet it was. You can still use slow motion in low light and get really cool results. Both continuous slow-mo at 100 or 120 frames per second, and even the ultra slow-mo at higher frame rates. The biggest extra factor in low light is shutter speed. The ZV1 won't allow you to set a slower shutter speed than the frame rate. So if you're filming at 120 frames per second, you can't have a slower shutter than 1/125. This means less of an already low amount of light coming into the camera and potential for light flicker since your shutter can be out of sync with the electricity of lights around you. You may have to boost your ISO level a bit to get enough exposure, but if you're shooting lights like in some of these examples, you can keep ISO fairly low. I'd say just get an image you like the look of on the ZV1 flip screen and the chances are it's going to be fine. My other tip for low light slow-mo is to try and shoot away from artificial light where you can, or to bring your own continuous light source. So that is it for today. What is my conclusion after all of this testing? Well, the ZV1 can achieve awesome results in low light, but make no mistake, it's a lot tougher and requires significantly more effort than shooting in the daytime. Thank you so much for watching, and especially for making it all the way to the end of this longer than usual video. If you enjoyed it or found it informative, then please consider a like, subscribe, or share of the video, and do let me know any thoughts or questions that you have in the comments. But until next time, take it easy.